Welcome to English Through Stories. I'm Justin. Do you sometimes find past tense verbs difficult when you speak? In each video, you'll hear useful vocabulary and grammar in context, repeated many times so you can use it more confidently. Today's story is about a London businessman, and we'll practice past tense verbs both regular and irregular. Let's begin.
Who was Thomas Betson? In 1475, Thomas Betson lived in London, England. He was a wool merchant. This meant he bought wool from farmers and sold it to other countries. Thomas was successful and made good money from his business. We know about Thomas because his letters still exist today. These letters tell us how he lived and worked. They show us what daily life was like for a businessman in medieval England over 500 years ago. Thomas came from a middle-class family. His father was a smaller merchant who traded in local markets. When Thomas was young, his father sent him to learn from other merchants. This was called being an apprentice. For 7 years, Thomas learned the wool business. He studied how to judge wool quality, how to bargain with farmers, and how to ship goods safely to other countries. By 1470, Thomas became independent. He started his own business with money his father saved. Thomas was smart and worked hard. Within 5 years, he built one of London's most successful wool trading companies. Morning time. Thomas woke up very early before the sun came up. In medieval times, people had no electric lights. They woke up when the sun rose and went to sleep when it got dark. The first thing Thomas did was light a candle. Candles were expensive, but Thomas could afford them. Poor people used simple oil lamps or went to bed when darkness fell. Thomas's house had glass windows, which were also expensive. Most people lived in houses with wooden shutters instead of glass. First, Thomas said his morning prayers. Religion was very important in medieval life. Every person prayed every day. Thomas knelt in his room and prayed to God for about 10 minutes. He thanked God for keeping him safe during the night and asked for success in his business that day. Then he got dressed. Thomas wore expensive clothes because he was successful. He put on a long wool coat that was brown or blue. These colors showed that he had money. There were laws about what clothes people could wear. Merchants like Thomas could wear nice wool clothes, but not gold or expensive furs. Only kings and nobles could wear those. Under his coat, Thomas wore a linen shirt. Linen was softer than wool and felt better against the skin. He put on wool stockings and leather shoes. His shoes had pointed toes, which was fashionable for successful men. Thomas owned several pairs of shoes, which made him wealthy by medieval standards. Thomas also wore a hat. Medieval people almost never went outside without covering their heads. His hat was made of felt and had a feather in it. The feather showed that Thomas was prosperous. For breakfast, Thomas ate bread, cheese, and meat. He drank ale, not water. Water was often dirty and could make people sick. Even children drank ale in the morning. The bread was dark and heavy, very different from white bread today. Thomas's breakfast was much better than what poor people ate. Working people usually had only bread and a little cheese. Meat was expensive. Thomas could afford to eat meat every day, which showed his success. His servants prepared his breakfast. Thomas employed 4 people in his house: a cook, 2 general servants, and a stable boy who took care of his horses. Having servants was a sign of wealth and success. Thomas's business. The wool trade. After breakfast, Thomas read his letters and planned his workday. In medieval England, wool was the most important business. England had many sheep, and their wool was the best in Europe. Thomas bought wool from English farmers. Then he sent the wool to other countries like France and Belgium. People there made the wool into cloth. This business made England very rich. The wool trade had strict rules. The government controlled it carefully. All merchants had to belong to special groups called guilds. Thomas belonged to the merchants of the staple. This guild controlled who could sell wool to other countries. The guild system was both helpful and limiting for Thomas. It gave him exclusive rights to export wool, but he had to follow many rules. The guild decided wool prices and quality standards. Members had to help each other during difficult times. If a member's ship sank, other members contributed money to help him recover. Thomas had to send all his wool through special ports. The most important port was Calais, in France. England controlled this city at that time. All English wool had to go through Calais before it could be sold to other countries. This system protected English merchants but also limited their freedom. Thomas could not sell directly to customers in other European cities. Everything had to go through Calais first. This added cost and time to every transaction, but it also meant that English merchants worked together instead of competing destructively. A day at the harbor. Most mornings, Thomas walked to the London docks by the River Thames. The river looked very different 500 years ago. It was wider and had wooden docks sticking out into the water. The harbor was always busy and noisy. Workers shouted to each other. Ships made creaking sounds. The air smelled like tar, rope, and river mud. Thomas could hear many different languages as merchants from different countries did business. The ships were called cogs. They were made of wood and had one big sail. These ships could carry 50 to 200 tons of wool. That's about the same as 10 to 40 elephants. Loading and unloading was hard work. Men carried heavy bags of wool on their backs. Thomas always checked his wool carefully. Quality was very important. His reputation depended on selling exactly what he promised. Different parts of England produced different types of wool. Thomas knew the difference just by touching it. He could tell where wool came from by feeling it. Wool from the Cotswolds was soft and fine. Wool from Yorkshire was stronger and coarser. Merchants in Europe knew these differences too, and they paid different prices accordingly. Thomas also had to arrange payment. This was complicated because there were no banks like today. Most business was done on credit. This meant Thomas might sell wool today but get paid months later. He wrote special letters that worked like checks. These financial arrangements required trust and personal relationships. Thomas had done business with some merchants for 20 years. They knew he always delivered what he promised and paid his debts on time. This reputation was Thomas's most valuable possession. Thomas's office. Thomas's office was in his house near the docks. It was simple but had everything he needed for business. He kept his money and important papers in strong wooden boxes with iron locks. The office had a large wooden table where Thomas worked. On the table, he kept his account books, letters, and business documents. Shelves along the walls held more books and papers. Thomas was one of the few people in London who could read and write well. For math, Thomas used a counting board. This was a wooden table with lines drawn on it. He put coins on different lines to add and subtract numbers. It took skill to use this system well. Thomas could do complex calculations quickly using this method. Writing was expensive in medieval times. Paper was new and costly. Many documents were written on parchment, which was made from animal skin. Thomas used feathers from geese as pens. He made ink from tree parts, iron, and gum. If Thomas made a mistake while writing, he could not erase it. He had to start again. This made writing very slow and careful work. Thomas employed a clerk who helped with writing and copying documents. This saved time and reduced mistakes. Thomas wrote many letters every day. He worried about many things: bad weather that could sink his ships, pirates who might steal his wool, and wars between countries that could stop trade. His letters revealed the constant stress of medieval business. In one letter, Thomas wrote about waiting 3 weeks for news of a ship that left for Calais. He did not know if the ship arrived safely or sank in a storm. This uncertainty was part of every merchant's daily life. Social life and relationships. Success in medieval business was about knowing the right people. Thomas belonged to several important groups. His guild, the merchants of the staple, met regularly. They made rules about wool prices and quality. These meetings also included big dinners and parties. Marriage was also about business. Merchant families married their children to other merchant families. This created networks of trust and cooperation. Thomas knew the business connections of dozens of families. Thomas married Catherine, the daughter of another wool merchant. Their marriage brought together 2 successful trading families. Catherine brought a dowry of £500, which was a large sum of money. Thomas used this money to expand his business. The guild system helped Thomas but also limited him. It gave him special rights to sell wool, but he had to follow strict rules. Guild members had to maintain quality standards and charge agreed prices. They also had to help other guild members when they had problems. Religion was another important part of social life. Thomas belonged to a church and probably to religious groups. These groups helped members' families when someone died or became sick. They also prayed together and gave money to poor people. Thomas donated money to his local church every year. This was expected of successful merchants. The church used this money to help poor people and to maintain the building. Thomas's donations also showed his prosperity to other members of the community. Dangers and profits. The wool business was dangerous but could make people very rich. Pirates were a big problem. The English Channel had many pirates from different countries. Even official navy ships might steal from merchants during wars. Thomas had to hire armed guards for his ships or travel with other merchants for safety. There was insurance for ships, but it was expensive and did not always work well. In 1478, Thomas lost an entire shipment to pirates near Calais. The wool was worth £800, which was more than most people earned in their entire lives. Thomas had insurance, but the insurance company argued about paying. It took 2 years to resolve the case, and Thomas only received half his money back. Weather was equally dangerous. Medieval ships had no weather forecasts and simple navigation tools. Storms could destroy a whole year's profits in one day. Thomas's letters often mentioned ships that were weeks late. He never knew if his wool reached its destination or sank in the ocean. Ships depended on wind and weather. A journey from London to Calais might take 2 days with good wind, or 2 weeks if storms prevented sailing. Thomas had to plan for these delays, but they still caused problems with customers who expected their wool to arrive on time. Politics also created problems. The 15th century had many wars between England and France. There were also civil wars in England. A new king or a new war could close markets overnight or lead to the government taking merchants' goods. During the Wars of the Roses, Thomas sometimes could not trade for months at a time. Different kings supported different merchants, and Thomas had to be careful not to appear to support the wrong side. Political changes could ruin a merchant's business overnight. Despite these risks, successful merchants could become very wealthy. The profit from selling English wool in Europe could be 300% or more. A good merchant like Thomas might handle hundreds of tons of wool each year. Thomas's account books showed that in a good year, he could make £2,000 profit. This was an enormous sum. A skilled craftsman earned about £10 per year. Thomas made in 1 year what most people earned in 200 years. Family life. Thomas's letters show us his personal life too. Like most merchants, he spent long periods away from home traveling for business. His wife had to manage much of the business while he was gone. Merchant wives needed special skills. They had to read, write, and do math. They managed household accounts, supervised servants, and wrote letters to suppliers and customers. Catherine Betson was unusual for a medieval woman because she could read and write as well as most men. When Thomas traveled to Calais or other cities, Catherine ran the London office. She negotiated with wool suppliers, paid bills, and kept the account books. Children in merchant families got practical education. Boys learned business skills as apprentices to other merchants. Girls learned to manage households and got basic education in reading and writing. Thomas and Catherine had 3 children, 2 sons and 1 daughter. Their older son, William, was learning the wool trade. At age 14, he went to work with Thomas's business partner in Calais. William was learning French and Flemish, languages needed for international trade. Their younger son, Robert, was only 8 years old. He attended a school run by local priests, where he learned to read, write, and do basic mathematics. Robert would probably also become a merchant when he grew up. Their daughter, Alice, was 12 years old. She was learning household management from her mother. Alice could already read and write, and she helped Catherine with business letters. When Alice married, she would bring valuable skills to her husband's family. Medieval merchants stayed in touch through letters that mixed business news with personal information. Thomas's letters asked about his partner's health, congratulated them on family events, and discussed mutual friends. The medieval business year. Medieval commerce followed different patterns than modern business. Trade depended on seasons, weather, religious holidays, and farming cycles. Spring was wool season because farmers cut sheep's wool after winter. Thomas spent March and April traveling to farms throughout England. He inspected wool quality and negotiated prices with farmers. This was the most important time of the year for his business. During wool season, Thomas rode his horse from farm to farm. He carried sample bags to collect wool from different flocks. Back in London, he compared these samples to decide which farmers offered the best quality. Thomas developed relationships with dozens of farmers over many years. Summer had the best weather for sailing ships to Europe. Thomas sent most of his wool to Calais between May and August. Summer sailing was safer, but it also meant that all merchants were trying to ship at the same time. This created competition for space on ships. Autumn was harvest time when farmers had money to pay their bills, but storms also made shipping dangerous. Thomas used autumn to collect payments from farmers and to plan for the next year's business. Winter was the quietest season for the wool trade. Ships rarely sailed in winter because storms were too dangerous. Thomas used winter months to maintain his business relationships, plan for the next year, and handle financial accounts. Religious holidays strongly affected business. Major holidays like Easter and Christmas stopped business for days or weeks. Lent limited certain business activities. Saints' days and local festivals created a complex calendar of when business could and could not happen. Thomas had to plan his business around more than 50 religious holidays each year. During these times, ships did not sail, markets were closed, and legal contracts could not be signed. This religious calendar made medieval business more complicated than modern commerce. Without electric lights, business hours were limited by daylight. In winter, Thomas might work only 8 or 9 hours. In summer, he could work 14 or 15 hours. This seasonal change required careful planning. Medieval business technology. Medieval merchants were more sophisticated than many people think. The wool trade led to many financial innovations that we still use today. Letters of credit let merchants do business without carrying dangerous amounts of gold and silver. Bills of exchange allowed international payments without shipping coins across borders. Thomas used double-entry bookkeeping, a system imported from Italian merchants. This allowed him to track complex transactions across multiple countries and currencies. These accounting methods were surprisingly modern. Thomas learned double-entry bookkeeping from an Italian merchant who taught him the system in exchange for favorable wool prices. This knowledge gave Thomas an advantage over competitors who still used older, simpler accounting methods. Communication networks were also sophisticated. Merchant guilds had regular messenger services between major trading cities. News could travel from London to Calais in just a few days. Merchants used codes and symbols to protect business secrets in their letters. Thomas employed professional messengers to carry his most important letters. These men rode fast horses and could travel from London to Calais in 3 days with good weather. For very urgent messages, Thomas paid extra for messengers who traveled day and night. Merchants also used simple codes in their letters to hide sensitive information. Thomas had special symbols for different types of wool and different customers. If competitors intercepted his letters, they could not easily understand his business plans. Thomas's death and legacy. Thomas Betson died in 1486. His death came at the end of an important era in English commerce. The Wars of the Roses had just ended, and the Tudor dynasty was beginning. The world was changing quickly. Thomas became ill in the winter of 1485. Medieval medicine could do little to help him. He suffered from what doctors today would probably call pneumonia. Thomas spent his last months organizing his business affairs and ensuring his family would be provided for. In his will, Thomas left most of his wealth to his wife and children. Catherine inherited the house and the London business operations. William, his older son, received the international trading contacts and rights to export wool. Robert, the younger son, got money to start his own business when he came of age. 6 years after Thomas died, Columbus reached America. New trade routes to Asia would soon change European commerce forever. The wool trade that made Thomas wealthy was already evolving. English merchants were starting to export finished cloth instead of raw wool. But in the 1470s and 1480s, Thomas represented the height of medieval commercial success. His letters give us a unique view of medieval life. They show us a world where business was personal, trust was everything, and a merchant's reputation was his most valuable possession. What Thomas's story teaches us. Thomas Betson's story shows us that medieval life was not simple or primitive. Medieval merchants were cosmopolitan people who operated across national borders, spoke multiple languages, and dealt with complex legal and financial systems. Their world was more dangerous than ours. Thomas faced risks from pirates, storms, and wars that modern business people rarely experience. But medieval merchants also operated in networks of personal trust and mutual obligation that provided security and meaning. The wool trade was one of the economic foundations of medieval Europe. English wool clothed people from Scotland to Italy. The profits from this trade funded cathedral construction and military campaigns. Understanding this system helps us understand medieval society. Medieval merchants like Thomas created the foundations of modern international business. They developed financial instruments, accounting systems, and trading networks that evolved into our modern economy. Their innovations in banking, insurance, and commercial law influenced business practices for centuries. A medieval day ends. As evening came in medieval London, Thomas ended his working day as he began it, with prayer. By candlelight, he reviewed his accounts, read letters that arrived during the day, and planned tomorrow's activities. Church bells marked the time, vespers at sunset, compline before sleep. Unlike our modern world with constant electric light, medieval people lived in rhythm with natural light and the religious calendar. In the evening, Thomas's family gathered in the main room of their house. They sat by the fire and talked about the day's events. Catherine reported on household matters and any business that had occurred while Thomas was at the docks. The children played simple games or listened to stories. Books were expensive and rare, so most entertainment was conversation, music, or storytelling. Thomas sometimes told stories about his travels to other countries or about interesting people he had met in business. Thomas's house grew quiet as servants finished their work and family members prepared for sleep. Without modern entertainment, evenings were time for conversation, reading for those who could read, and early rest. Before going to bed, Thomas checked that all doors and windows were securely locked. Medieval cities could be dangerous at night. He made sure his strong boxes were locked and his valuable papers were hidden safely. Through Thomas Betson's story, we see a world where business success required personal courage, intelligence, and social skills. His daily life combined practical challenges with intellectual demands that we can still respect today. Most remarkably, his story survives because medieval people understood the importance of keeping business records. Thomas's letters were saved and copied because they documented important relationships and legal obligations. Today, they serve as our window into a fascinating world where wool was king, merchants were adventurers, and daily life mixed routine and risk in ways we can barely imagine.
Well done. You finished your first story with past tense verbs. Next, you'll hear a new story with even more past tense practice and fresh vocabulary. Continue with the next story and get even more practice.